Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a reading vlog. This is actually a themed reading vlog. I know, who am I? But I was just having a thought yesterday and I decided to commit to it. It's a thought that I decided to commit to on a whim, so this may not be very successful. But I recently DNF'd a book that was one of my most anticipated reads of the year, and that is Immortal Longings by Gong. It is a shame, the roller coaster ride that I have been on with this book over the past couple of months. I was sent an early review copy of this. I was sent an e-arc of this. And then I got it as my book of the month in July. Then I was contacted again by the publisher, like, did I want a physical copy of it? I'd already chosen this as my book of the month, but I just thought it was weird. It seems like there were so many signs pointing to me really loving this. And Gong is most famous for These Violent Delights, which is a Romeo and Juliet retelling set in 1920s Shanghai. But this is her first adult fantasy, and it is a retelling of Antony and Cleopatra. Here's the thing, I guess I didn't realize that this was set in semi-modern day in a fantasy world, and I don't typically like that. And I hear you saying, Jenny, one of your favorite books of the year is an urban fantasy that is essentially set in the modern day, Jade City. I know, and I was having that little voice in the back of my head telling me that I was just being silly because I loved Jade City. But I think the thing is, Jade City is modern, but it's not modern day, if that makes sense. It felt very 70s to me. This feels very 90s at the earliest that it could possibly be. But this is a world where people can body swap, like you can jump into someone else's body. There's going to be a competition element, and it is the first book in a trilogy, but it is a retelling of Antony and Cleopatra. I've thoroughly enjoyed Gong in the past, but I don't even know whether I should say that since I've only really read one book from her fully. I didn't carry on with These Violent Ends. I don't know why. I really did think that I had read it. Like last year when her newer series came out, I started reading it and I realized I didn't ever finish the These Violent Delights duology. But her other series, which I can't remember the name of, Foul Lady Fortune, I think, is also kind of a Shakespeare retelling. I think it's As You Like It, but it's also set in 1930s Shanghai, and it carries on pretty much immediately from the events of These Violent Delights. So this is entirely new, and you can start here, and it is fully set in a fantasy world. I was really struggling with this because I guess I thought fantasy world, but more similar to kind of the time period of Antony and Cleopatra, but that is not really what's going on here. And so I know that I just need to give it a chance. I just need to commit to it, and I just need to give it a chance, and I need to understand too that it is just the first book in a trilogy. But the thought that I was having yesterday, the whim that I went with, is that I felt like I should probably try to reread Antony and Cleopatra. It has been so many years since I read it, and I've always counted it as one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. And recently, Kayla from Books and Lala, I think, also reread Antony and Cleopatra to help her with Immortal Longings, because I think she had the same exact experience that I'm currently having, that she just really wanted to put the book down in the first part. So she went back and reread Antony and Cleopatra, and it really reinvigorated her to give her a love for Immortal Longings. And so since I'd already been thinking about it, I felt like her mentioning it in her July wrap-up was a sign to me that I also should commit to rereading Antony and Cleopatra. And it's hard for me, you're gonna hear me say Antony or Anthony multiple times throughout this video because I didn't realize that Shakespeare's play is actually called Antony and Cleopatra and not Antony and Cleopatra, which is what Mark Antony's name really was. His name was Marcus Antonius, so we call him Mark Antony. But that was the first shock. I did not realize actually that that is what the Shakespeare play was called, but I've always considered this one of my favorites of his. It's just been so long since I read it. I thought if I reread this, it would probably set me up to enjoy this a little bit more because I thought These Violent Delights was so smart in the way that it reworked Romeo and Juliet. But I think it was interesting because Romeo and Juliet is a straightforward tragedy. And so I think it lends itself well to being set in different periods in time. Whereas to me, Antony and Cleopatra has always read like one of the history plays. And that's interesting. We can get into that discussion. I have always viewed it as a history play. And so to me, moving a history play out of the time period in which it's normally set, or out of just in general a more historical time period, I think is very hard for me. But of course, that goes into how do we classify Antony and Cleopatra? I think many people would say that this is a tragedy and not a history play. And I think it is more technically categorized as a tragedy, but it's always read to me like a history play. I also consider Julius Caesar a history play, but that's just me. I like to be the odd one out. But the introduction to this Oxford edition, I ordered this Oxford edition because I really enjoy their editions of Shakespeare, because their introductions are like 100 pages long. In this edition, yeah, there you go. We're still in the introduction at this point. So the introductions are incredibly valuable. And that's the first thing that was mentioned in this introduction, is just how hard it is to categorize this as a play. Some people view it as a history play, some people view it as a tragedy, and some people view it as just straightforwardly a romance, which is not necessarily a genre that Shakespeare ever had other plays in. But I think it's interesting that people wanted to talk about it like that. This is really fascinating. Just the introduction alone, I feel like you could write an essay about. I have learned so much from this introduction. It is insane to me. But I just thought I was going to commit to this idea. I think this is going to be really fun. I think this weekend I can read through the play, and then I can at least get started on this. And then I think my enjoyment of this will go up. So I am really looking forward to it. I thought maybe I would just take y'all along for the ride, but I will update you when I get further into the play. It is Shakespearean update time. Yes, I am coming to you from the new shelf location. I am filming a video that is all about that, but I don't really know when you're seeing it. I don't know if you'll have seen it before this vlog, because a lot of work still needs to be done on them. And I have 4 shelves here. It's not enough room for all the books I own, but that's a conversation that we can have another day. I really just wanted to update on Antony and Cleopatra, which I am still in Act 1 of, so you know what, not that far, but I'm obsessed with it. Just obsessed with it. I'm particularly obsessed with Cleopatra because she is so manipulative so far. Every time she has spoken about Antony, she was like, if he's happy, tell him I'm really sad and that I'm really upset. But if he's sad, tell him that I'm really happy. Tell him that I'm mirthful. So she's very manipulative and kind of in your face a bit. And I really, really like that. And something that I also really like about the play thus far is that they are already together. So this is really kind of going into that last segment of their lives. It's not giving us a full-blown history with them, but I think it's interesting because one of the themes so far is that they are already reminiscing on the past and the good times during their relationship. And since that's a theme already in Act 1, I can only assume that's going to be one of the major themes of all 5 acts. It has been so long since I read this. I am treating this as if it is the first time. And now my interpretation of Antony and Cleopatra is just so married to the historical sources. It's just so married in general to history. And Shakespeare is never trying to tell you a linear portrait of events. He's really not ever trying to tell you how things went. And I think it's interesting because Antony and Cleopatra is just a weird play, because you could class it as a history play, but you could also class it as a tragedy. And I know a lot of people take issue with his history plays because they aren't accurate at all. But this is one you don't hear much complaint about. And I guess if you class it as a tragedy, maybe you're not trying to pay so much attention to the historical record and to what actually happened, and so people give him leeway here. Really, the reason I am updating so soon is that I finished this 100-page introduction last night. I want to say that was worth the price of admission alone, just for that introduction. I learned more from that introduction than I did in entire courses that I took in university about Shakespeare. I mean that truly and seriously. It gave me so much context for Shakespeare. It gave me so much context for the meaning of the play at the time. I think it was really valuable if you're an actor and you're going to be performing this. It gave you a lot of background to how this play has always been performed. And then it went into different interpretations of this play, which I just thought was fantastic. Truly, the introduction was amazing. The notes are also really great. As you can see, they take up kind of the majority of the page. You can really see it here. Some of those notes are incredibly needless in my opinion, but some of them are really, really valuable. And I just think this is an awesome edition. I don't know that I have ever read an Oxford edition, even though I own a few of them of Shakespeare's. So that is definitely going to move some of those up my TBR, because what an incredible intro this had. It's interesting because thinking about the first few chapters that I tried to get into with Immortal Longings, Calla, who is the Cleopatra character, was very, very off-putting to me. And normally I would say I like a character that's intended to be unlikable, particularly if they are a woman. But she was a struggle for me. The world was a struggle for me. I'm really glad that I'm doing this, because I think this is going to give me the context that I need to understand the retelling. And the retelling, I think, is going to give you the entire picture of their relationship and the entire picture of their lives, and not just this end, this really tragic end. If you know nothing about Antony and Cleopatra, they have a very famous love story. Some people debate, was this love? I personally think it was. Cleopatra had previously had a relationship with Julius Caesar, and when he was killed, she did eventually get involved with Antony, because Antony is one of the ones who hunted down Caesar's killers. It's always viewed that Antony just kind of deviated from Rome. He wanted to be with Cleopatra. They shared children. Octavian, who was eventually to become Augustus Caesar, doesn't like this, and he does want Egypt for his own. This is a really, really watered down version of events. Please read some really great nonfiction on this, because what a ride it was. But eventually their rivalry kind of culminates in the Battle of Actium, which happens there in Egypt, and Octavian wins. This does eventually result in the very famous suicides of Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra's is a really famous death. She supposedly used an asp, which is a really poisonous snake there in Egypt. And if you go into the Roman Forum today and you see the spot where they burned Julius Caesar's body for the funeral, the monument there is now supported with pillars from the ships of Cleopatra and Antony that Octavian brought back to Rome after their defeat. Their story is very, very multi-layered. It's a romantic story, of course, at heart, but it's always been framed as Antony kind of losing his way. In the Elizabethan period, when this is being written, romance would not even have been thought of in the same way that we think of it as. Romance would almost have been seen as a sickness of the mind, like something that you couldn't avoid, something that was making you go kind of mad a little bit. Romance, of course, was not really the basis for a lot of relationships in the Elizabethan period, particularly marriages. And so the concept of that is interesting. So this play, I'm sure, is going to frame it as though he's kind of losing his mind a bit. But the interesting dynamic is also always about colonialism when we think about Antony and Cleopatra's relationship, in my opinion. If you have ever read the Aeneid, Dido and Aeneas, that's kind of based on Antony and Cleopatra's relationship. Dido is the queen of Carthage, so she's also an African queen, tempting someone away from Rome and from kind of an imperial future. Their relationship has always been used in terms of propaganda, particularly by Augustus, and Antony was, of course, looked down upon at the time for this. Cleopatra has always been viewed as a vixen and as a femme fatale, because she not only had Antony, but she had Caesar. This play, I think, is going to analyze this in terms of gender as well, kind of Rome as masculine, Egypt as feminine, because that was also really the way the Romans looked at it. Egypt was very lush, it was very rich looking, very colorful. Rome was very austere, they're very serious, even though really when you look back at Roman history, a lot of crazy things were going down, and a lot was just being done 100% on the aesthetics. So really, who are they to judge? But they really did not like kind of the Eastern style. And so, of course, all those bad things are kind of associated with the female, especially Cleopatra, and all of the good things, the serious things, that's associated with being Roman. So Antony is kind of viewed as being emasculated. All of this is explored in this play to my memory, and I am really, really excited about it. I just love Shakespeare. I really love him. I know that I often say I don't like to read plays. I think I would rather see them performed. With Shakespeare, I don't feel that way. I really would rather read him, and I think it's because I just enjoy the poetry of the language so much. It is gorgeous. Even so far, I mean, stunning quotes. I mean, this is amazing. I would love to see this put on, actually, because I think it would be a feat. We've changed location a couple of times, And I imagine that it would have been very, very hard to do during an ongoing production. I promise I'll stop updating so soon in blogs because I know it makes my blogs incredibly long sometimes, but I'm really excited. I'm really loving this. Yes, you were getting post-shower, Jenny, because it was, I think, 96 today, felt like 101. And we had a fire alarm at work that meant we were outside in the blaring down sun for, I'm guessing, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. I don't know. It felt like an eternity out there. We were all just really hot and sweaty. So trust me, this is an improvement. I just wanted to update and say that I have finished Antony and Cleopatra, and I have started Immortal Longings, so I feel like I'm in a good place to give an update on both. Antony and Cleopatra, as you may can see, I tabbed up. I absolutely loved this. I gave it 4 stars because I do think there are some shortcomings here. I think there is a lot that could have been better about this. This is so interesting. I mean, truly it is, especially to be a work that I remember reading, but it was in so many ways just a brand new reading experience to me. It felt like I was reading a brand new book. A misconception that I feel like I had, and something that apparently I misremembered about my first time reading this, is that I actually thought Cleopatra had a much larger role in this plot than she wound up having. To me, she had minimal screen time, but what's interesting is that I felt like she was a fully fledged character, like I had a grip on her in a way that I don't feel like I had a grip on many other characters in the narrative. So it's interesting that her character was conveyed so sharply in such few lines, in my opinion. She also didn't get nearly as powerful a part in the play as what I was expecting. I often find that I feel like the female roles in Shakespeare are some of the most interesting, and he gives them the most interesting lines 9 times out of 10, particularly in terms of the tragedies. If we're thinking just exclusively about the tragedies, think about Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is the backbone of that play, and she has the most beautiful soliloquies. She has the most beautiful lines. Lady Macbeth is very much the same way. To me, this play was in so many ways Antony's story, but in most others, I would say this is actually Augustus's play, Octavian's. To me, he was also a very crystal clear character. He was very cold, he was very calculated, and the way he spoke was so distinct. Sometimes when you're reading plays, it's like I've moved on and I didn't read the name of the character. I always knew when he was speaking. But there were so many characters in this, and I think it could be argued that there were too many characters. Did we need all of these just really small characters that had 1 or 2 lines? They would come on for a couple of scenes maybe, and that was basically it. They served nothing else in the plot. That was mentioned in the introduction. That's really caught people off guard in the past, and they don't really know how to present the play, how to put the play on with some of these characters. But the good far outweighs the bad. This was brilliant. I mean, honestly, it was. And let's just get this out of the way. Let's fangirl about Shakespeare for a moment. I mean, people will just say, oh, that reads like Shakespeare, or your poetry is like Shakespeare. Are you trying to be Shakespeare? Honestly, all of those mentions are deserved. Shakespeare should just be a word in our vocabulary. He should be the man we are measuring everything against because, oh my gosh. What's really interesting to me about this play in particular, you could probably argue it for many of his plays, but in my opinion, this one was really straightforward in that it could be read one of 2 ways. This is either just a really eloquently beautiful, tragic play that is really imbued with a lot of romance. Nostalgia is a massive theme throughout this play and reminiscing about the good old days. It's dark and it's heavy in places, but at its heart, it's just a really beautiful, tragic love story. On the other hand, this whole play can be taken as satire, it can be taken as a joke. There were so many lines in this where the note said this can be read as a bawdy joke or it can be read as a line of poetry. And I really just thought that was brilliant because I thought about the fact that you could stage this play as a satire, as kind of comedic, but you could also stage it as that beautiful tragedy. And so every line in the play, and essentially the through line of the play, has to be read in both of those ways and could be easily interpreted as a joke, comedy, or as beautiful, tragic poetry. Unbelievable to me that this was sprouted from his mind. I understand other people may have worked on it with him. I get it. I know there are a lot of people who think Shakespeare didn't write the plays. Miss me with that. that has always smacked of classism to me, that people don't think someone who wasn't formally educated could write at this level. Intelligence isn't something that they hand out at the university level, so miss me with that. He wrote these. This is one of my favorites. Honestly, this has got to be in my top 5. I loved this. Sincerely, I am now obsessed with Octavian. I never thought that day would come. I always thought that I didn't like Augustus. And I feel like in a lot of the historical sources and a lot of the nonfiction that I've read, I have never taken to him. So I am really shocked that I loved him as much as I did. I really loved kind of his cold, stick in the mud exterior. But Antony is, to me, the standout here. He really, truly is absolutely fantastic. He is the character I think that you're reading the play for. And wow, what a ride it is. Now let's get into Immortal Longings. I am about 100 pages in. I'm obsessed with this. This book is actually good. Y'all are just mean, okay? I've been seeing a lot of negative reviews of this. In fact, at this point, I would say I don't know that I have seen a positive review of this aside from Kayla from Books and Lala, so I knew I would probably like it. Yes, I did DNF this about 3 chapters in a few weeks ago, but who was I would like to ask myself. I really do think rereading the play set me up to love this a lot because I'm really enjoying comparing it to the play. This is set in a fantasy world that is very much like 90s Hong Kong, kind of the walled city, and I really, really liked the vibe of it. I thought that was going to be what turned me off, that I really wasn't going to like the urban setting of it. But I really liked the idea of a death game set across a city, which is essentially what this is. There is a competition. It's to the death. It's very Hunger Games-like. There's going to be a single winner. All of the other competitors have to be eliminated. But they're not just within an arena. They're not just within a singular place. They can play this game throughout the city. There is body jumping involved. The magic system of this book is that you could jump into another body. And that, to me, is easily the most fascinating thing about this, because I think there's a lot of questions around consent. Like, there have been instances where you think about romantic moments between characters and they're in someone else's body, not their own birth body. There are also really interesting questions about gender here. So you could say abandon your birth body if you felt it didn't represent your gender. You also have people who are willing to jump into any body. It really doesn't matter what gender they are. And so I just think that's fascinating. I think there's a layered conversation going on there. I don't think consent is going to be talked about to the degree that I would like it, because I think that's really the interesting thing here. But this is a really bleak and dark society, and so maybe it's just kind of going along with the fact that the rich can take advantage of the poor, and so if you have the ability to jump, that's your right to do it. So I think that's an interesting social commentary. But I do want to say, I've gone into this with really positive feelings. I am absolutely loving this, but I feel like I'm enjoying it because I am transposing the love that I have, not just of the play that I just read, but also of the historical figures, Cleopatra and Antony. So I think that's the really interesting thing about Immortal Longings. It is a retelling, but it is a retelling of a retelling. Shakespeare's telling of events is just not how it went down. He's going for glory. He's going for something pretty. He's also going for something that translates well on the stage, something that's really dramatic. So he also has to cut down events that happened to make the play shorter. So things like Antony's marriage to Octavia, who is Augustus's sister, that is really, really fast in the play. In real life, they were married a long time and they had children together. You would not know that in the play. The scenes with Pompey are also really, really interesting because they're also crunched down. And so I think if you're going into Immortal Longings with the background knowledge of what actually happened, you're going to be frustrated. If you're going into it with the knowledge of what happens in the play, I think you're going to have a good time. But I think what I've seen in a lot of the negative reviews is just how many people are unfamiliar with Antony and Cleopatra as a play. So I think my enjoyment of it has to be coming from the fact that I just read the play. And what I loved about the play, really the theme that I loved about the play, was the past haunting the present. And I don't feel like we have gotten there yet with Immortal Longings, and that might be something we're saving for other books in the series. But my gosh, the play was so much about the past coming back to get you. I mean, honestly, everyone in it is someone who was a figure in Julius Caesar's time and is possibly their child. So you have Octavian or Augustus, who is Caesar's adopted child. You have Pompey, who is the son of Pompey, who was in Caesar's triumvirate and Julius Caesar's triumvirate. You have Antony, who was there technically for both of these big events. But then you have the relationship between him and Cleopatra, which is constantly framed as something nostalgic, them looking back on and remembering when they first met one another. And I think that's really brilliant. I think it's going to be interesting to see it explored in this fantasy trilogy. To me, the fun so far in Immortal Longings has been how the names have been changed and some of the genders have been swapped. So I'm having a really great time. But so far in Immortal Longings, my favorite character is August, who was clearly intended to be Augustus or Octavian. So I don't know who I am anymore. Like, am I someone who likes Augustus Caesar? I'll update you as I figure this out because I'm kind of going through an identity crisis. Well, there's been a big difference in here since I think the last clip that I filmed in here. I am coming to you after a massive sneezing attack. So I think actually for the past 3 or 4 days, it seems like I have had like massive attacks of sneezing multiple times in a row. And I feel like that just kind of brought me into an allergy haze, frankly. But last night, Christy and I did reading sprints here on my channel, and I knew that it would be the perfect opportunity to go on and finish Immortal Longings. And that is what happened. I have a lot of mixed opinions on this. Most of them are positive. I rated this book 4 stars. I'll go on and spoil it for you. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I really, really loved it. I thought it had a lot of interesting things to say. And frankly, the world itself was just so interesting to me that really kept propelling me forward. But now that I'm on the other side, now that I have finished it, I understand why people don't like it. Like, I really just wanted to post on Instagram while I was reading it, this book is really good, y'all are just mean. And I still feel like that. I still feel like people have been a little bit hard on this because I do think people are going to compare this to her other Shakespearean retellings, specifically These Violent Delights. And to me, there has been a marked change in her writing since then. I felt like These Violent Delights held my hand a little bit too much. Like, in many ways, I felt like that book was overwritten. And I felt like she was constantly giving you every single detail in a scene to the point where you weren't really imagining it for yourself. You really were imagining her version of events. She didn't leave anything up to your imagination. To me, that really wasn't present here, but I think this was also a shorter book. One of the big things with this, though, is that it is book 1 in a trilogy. And I feel so oddly about certain components of the story, knowing that and knowing where this book left off. And if I'm going to talk about it specifically as a retelling of Antony and Cleopatra, I think a lot of interesting choices were made because big characters, in my opinion, big characters or characters who stood in for fairly large characters in the play, they've already been killed off, or they never played that large a role and there's really no indication that they're going to. For example, one of the main characters in the play to me is Enobarbus. This is so interesting because Enobarbus is someone who exists in the historical record, but he's not somebody who gets a lot of attention from the ancient historians. But really in this play, I would say he's got to be one of the main characters. And so I was interested to see kind of how Gong would play with this character and what was done with his stand-in, or who I'm assuming is his stand-in. That was really interesting to me. Other characters that I felt were fairly minor in the play really had a large role in this book. But again, all of that is really interesting when you think about the fact this is only the first book in a trilogy. We have 2 more books before the entire retelling is completed. A major component of this book, and I think this is the part that I've seen the most people complain about, and I have to say I understand this. This is the part I had the most questions about on the other side once I finished reading it. There is a competition element in this, a competition to the death. People are competing for money. You willingly enter this competition, and the main characters, you know, from the very first couple of chapters, they're really entering the competition to try to kill the king, who is a stand-in for Julius Caesar. So the winner of this competition will get to go up and meet him, and so they really want to kill him at that time. A lot of people have really slammed the competition element of it, and I think with good reason, because to me, it was easily the weakest element of the story, and it felt like the door was closed on that storyline. I don't feel like that's going to be something that's present in the other books at all, so it almost feels like, well, why did they have it? A lot of people talk about it in comparison to the Hunger Games and just how the themes and the aspect of competing in a game to the death for money were kind of done throughout the Hunger Games, trying to do something so that your family earned enough food to live. That's definitely present here, but this is more comparable to Squid Game. And a lot of people have compared this to Squid Game and said it falls off, and it does. They even go by numbers in this. The players are talked about as having a number. They're never named because there's so much swapping involved. They jump from one body to another. But also, like Squid Game, this is a voluntary competition. In Squid Game, one of the most brilliant things about it to me was that you understood what you were signing up for. You knew exactly what it was. It's going to be a game to the death, and you chose to do it. It was voluntary. And that's here, and you would think that really would lend itself to a lot of interesting discussion or something between the characters. But I'm going to tell you the honest truth. I never knew anything about the other competitors, so the whole time I was wondering what's the point of having the competition. I even thought that could have been interesting as a retelling of the Shakespearean play, because there's definitely like a politicking, competitive element to some of the scenes with Pompey in particular in the play. But so much of what this book does right is just incredible to me in terms of the retelling. I definitely feel like I loved it because I reread the play, but everything they did thematically here, I feel like is something that was present in Shakespeare's play, specifically like the passage of time. I felt like that was a really big element in the play, the past being very present, you kind of reacting against the past. That's definitely the through line of this book. Everyone is operating with a certain modus operandi that has to do with what happened to them in the past. So I think that's really interesting. Cleopatra is also often talked about like with dreams. She's very much associated with dreaming, prophecy. That happens with Calla, who is our Cleopatra stand-in in this book. So I felt like it was a really masterful retelling. So much about it is interesting when you want to talk about it being a retelling, because I would say Antony and Cleopatra doesn't have, I don't want to say the name recognition, because I think most people know who Mark Antony and Cleopatra were, even if they haven't read the play. But I don't think as many people were going to go into this with as great a knowledge of the play as they would have her retelling of Romeo and Juliet, for example. Even if you haven't read Romeo and Juliet, you know the big names. You probably know most of the very big side characters, Tybalt, Mercutio, Benvolio. They all seem very vibrant in pop culture. In the play Antony and Cleopatra, I think you would know Antony, Cleopatra, you might know Augustus, and then I would say basically everyone else is a non-entity. Enobarbus, who is one of the big names in the play, is someone who doesn't get a lot in the historical record. So I feel like there was a lot of room for her to play here, and so there were a lot of liberties taken. So I can see that someone who's like a big fan of the play would say this wasn't the greatest retelling, though I think it got to the heart of what the play is about. But I have questions about the series moving forward, because I don't know how she is going to finish this retelling out when some things happened in this first book that I think have totally changed the vibe of the play. I can certainly see, especially if you aren't that familiar with the play, why this wouldn't have worked for you, because I think there were a lot of scenes put in that were put in specifically to allude to the play. There were characters that were put in, I think, specifically to allude to the play. And if you're reading this without any knowledge of that, I think those instances feel strange and they feel clunky. I really loved it. I'm really looking forward to the next book, but I think it's going to be a series that I'm going to have to judge once it's finished, because at this point, I don't know how I would judge it as an accurate retelling, but I do think it's really enjoyable. Now, for me, the body swapping was part of the interesting conversation around the book, and consent was never discussed in the way that I would have liked it. There was a scene where characters had sex in other people's bodies. And it was even addressed in the moment as if bodies are just vessels. They are not attached to bodies at all. They are only attached to their chi, to their soul. And so the body is completely meaningless. And what happens when you're in another person's body isn't a reflection on the body's owner. It's a reflection on you. And I thought that was interesting, but I don't know. It still was kind of squicky to me, because I just recently rewatched the horror that is Wonder Woman 1984, and a scene very similar to that occurs in that movie. And I'm thinking, okay, this dude just woke up one day and doesn't realize that he's had sex with someone when someone else was in his body. And that just really rubbed me the wrong way in that film. And that was kind of the vibe here. Even though it was explained in the book that the bodies had no feeling, like it's all about your soul, it's all about your chi. And when someone else is in your body, that's kind of meaningless, but it was just so odd to me, kind of the colonialism aspect of jumping into someone else's body. That's definitely a larger theme at play here, was colonialism. That's a large theme in the play as well. Rome taking over Egypt, very much a colonial attitude, but it's also kind of like masculine overtaking feminine, and so there was kind of a sexual side to the play, in my opinion, which was also present here. I really think if you're thinking about theme and idea, Chloe Gong really nailed this. There were parts reading this that I was going to rate it 5 stars, honestly, but I don't know that I felt that attached to the characters. It's interesting to talk about a retelling because I think this retelling is like double fold. It is a retelling of a retelling, like I said. So you're jumping into this not only with the love of the Shakespeare play or your knowledge of the Shakespeare play, but you're also jumping into this with your knowledge of Antony and Cleopatra as historical figures. And so that means you kind of feel something for them automatically, and other characters in the narrative that stand in for Octavia and Augustus, you also, I think, feel something for because you're going in with the historical knowledge as well as the knowledge of the play. But I loved this. I do think the romance could have been better. I think that's the part where it kind of slagged off, where they just kind of started saying like, oh, I love you. And you're thinking, really? Really? Do you even know him? But what was so interesting about the body jumping is that we never saw Antony in like the same body twice, but she always knew it was him. And to me, that was really romantic, that she knew him even though she didn't even know what he looked like. That was really romantic to me. I don't know. I loved it. I'm looking forward to the next book in the series. This was really, really fun. I loved reading Shakespeare. I haven't read Shakespeare in years, how refreshing it was to get back to his writing, but I also just loved this. So this was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed this vlog. I would love to know down below if you have read either of these, but that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.